Hello and welcome to another episode of Reluctant Book Reviews, a series where I try to make the last violent convulsions of our dying planet slightly more bearable for you by making fun of trashy books written by obnoxious uncles. And in today's edition, we are going to talk about economist, part-time historian and full-time asshole Sanjeev Sanyal's book, The Indian Renaissance, India's Rise After 1,000 Years of Decline, published in 2008. There, you can see the front cover of the book featuring high praise from some obscure Mallu stand-up comedian by the name of Shashi Tharoor. I know who that is. For the uninitiated, Sanjeev Sanyal is a former banker who has been the Finance Ministry's principal economic advisor since 2017, and earlier this year, he was also appointed to the PM's Economic Advisory Council. So a pretty influential guy in government and business circles, but he also has a pretty decent media career, books, columns, invitations to conferences and panels where his opinions are much sought after. So that's our guy, Sanjeev. Now, coming to the book, the thing I like about it the most is that it is quite short. My ebook version is just 198 pages, which is surprising considering all the ground Sanjeev covers here. Even more surprising, actually astounding, is that for such a supposedly bold intellectual project, it is almost comically light on sources and citations. There is no proper bibliography. All we have are just 10 pages of notes at the end of the book where a handful of academic sources sit side by side with links to newspaper articles and explanatory comments. If this isn't already making your spidey senses tingle a bit, check this out. In the first chapter of the book, Sanjeev takes the reader on a warp speed tour of Indian history, starting with the rise of the Indus Valley civilization and ending with India's independence from British rule in 1947. For summarizing the history of this entire period spanning almost 5,000 years, he cites a grand total of 9 unique sources. Let me repeat that, 9, not even double digits. I mean, Op India does better research than this dude. You could have just added a bunch of emojis after every sentence and turned your manuscript into a WhatsApp forward. Way more people would have read it for sure, and I would not have suffered permanent brain damage from being exposed to the mind droppings of a grade A moron. It may seem that I am exaggerating, but the simple-mindedness of Sanjeev's views is striking and is on display as soon as you start reading the book. Let it be known that his is a mind that, at least in historical matters, does not appreciate subtlety and complexity, and this causes him to adopt a wildly anachronistic outlook about history. Now, if you don't know what an historical anachronism is, don't worry, I had to look it up too, so let's ask Wikipedia. An anachronism is a chronological inconsistency in some arrangement, especially a juxtaposition of people, events, objects, language, terms, and customs from different time periods. So imagine you're watching some period drama and there's a massive battle and people are doing hand-to-hand combat and shooting arrows, and then suddenly someone rolls up in a tank. That is an anachronism. A very crude example, I know, but I hope it conveys the meaning. And historical anachronisms are not necessarily a bad thing. They're a common trope in science fiction, or you can make a joke out of them, like saying Jesus Christ was the first hippie or something like that. But when you're trying to write about history seriously, you have to be conscious of the historical specificity of modern ideas, concepts, and categories, and not blindly impose them upon the past. Unfortunately, that is pretty much how Sanjeev writes about history. Let me finally give you an example. In chapter 1, after establishing that India was the world's biggest economy around 180, he writes, "In a way, India's place in the ancient world was similar to that which is occupied by the United States today. It was not only the dominant center of economic and cultural activity, but also a magnet for various groups of people who came to seek either fortune or refuge from persecution." Now, there is so much insanity in this statement that I am going to ignore most of it. Let's just agree that there was an India 2000 years ago, and it was indeed the dominant center of economic and cultural activity. How do those things make it comparable to the US today? The United States' role as a superpower, which is what India was in the ancient world apparently, entails more than just having the largest GDP. Ever since the Second World War, the American state has held the responsibility of managing and maintaining a global system that facilitates the constant flow of capital, commodities, raw materials, and labor. In other words, the US is the primary caretaker of global capitalism, and over the last century, it has developed an extremely sophisticated apparatus which allows it to perform its role as the world's biggest superpower. This apparatus includes not just the global military intelligence surveillance network of the US, but also equally important are institutions like the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, Wall Street, the IMF, and the World Bank, and underlying their power and influence is the fact that the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. All of that is what makes the US the world's foremost superpower, and its economic and cultural supremacy is built on that apparatus. Suggesting that a politico-cultural entity called India fulfilled a similar role 2000 years ago is not just inaccurate, but almost completely absurd and meaningless. It betrays a shocking ignorance of what the world was like 2000 years ago and what it is like today. This man is unable to distinguish between the socio-economic relations that existed 2 millennia ago and one that exists under our current global capitalist system. And I don't think I'm being needlessly pedantic, nitpicking on one random statement to make him seem bad. The whole idea that India was the US of the ancient world feeds into his narrative of that period representing the golden age of Indian civilization. But more on that later. The US comparison might be the most infuriating anachronism I could find in this book, but it's definitely not the only one. At one point, talking about medicine in ancient India, he just casually mentions that plastic surgery was a routine procedure, and then there's this gem. It is amazing that 23 centuries ago, Kautilya was explicitly thinking about comparative advantage and the international division of labor. Both of these got a nice chuckle out of me, but by far, the funniest anachronism that pops up in the book is when Sanjeev is talking about the rise of the Mauryan Empire. According to tradition, the Mauryan Empire was built by Chanakya, also called Kautilya, a professor of political economy at Takshila University. Together with his pupil Chandragupta Maurya, he created the Mauryan Empire in order to check the advance of the Macedonian Greeks led by Alexander. Now, I don't know about you, but the moment I read the words professor of political economy, I was genuinely screeching with laughter. Also, I really want to believe that in the first draft of the book, Sanjeev had written something like Chanakya, professor of political economy at Takshila University, together with CEO Chandragupta Maurya, created the startup Mauryan Empire Holdings LLC and prevented a hostile takeover of the company by the Greek hedge fund Macedonia Capital, led by the young bisexual hotshot Alexander. And at this point, his editors were probably horrified reading this and said, Sanjeev, this is not history. This sounds like the setup for an insanely homoerotic piece of fan fiction. You gotta tone it down, man. Fine, you can keep the professor of political economy part, but the rest has to go. Alright, so now that we've had a little bit of fun, let's get serious, or as serious as one can get about a book as silly as this. Let's probe the core thesis of the book which Sanjeev lays out in its opening pages. During its golden age prior to the 11th century, India was a country that encouraged innovation and change. Indian society celebrated its risk takers. It was open to foreign trade, ideas and immigrants. Foreign students flocked to its universities even as foreign merchants flocked to its ports. Yet a change in cultural attitudes by the 11th century created a fossilized society obsessed with regulating all aspects of life according to fixed rules. Not surprisingly, this discouraged the spirit of innovation and led to a long and painful decline. India fell behind not just as an economy, but as a civilization. Now, before we proceed any further, for the sake of your own sanity, please just ignore the utterly anachronistic use of terms like country, economy, foreign trade, innovation, etc. If we have to engage with this mess, we have to deal with it on its own dumb terms. And the best part is that even when you do so, none of it makes any sense at all. For example, the primary metric Sanjeev employs to prove his theory is Angus Maddison's historical GDP estimates. That's it. There is not even an attempt at trying to use contemporary evidence in order to reconstruct the day-to-day lives of people who lived thousands of years ago, or to inquire about their standard of living, consumption patterns, and the complex socio-economic relations that govern their lives. One would imagine that such information would be relevant to a discussion about economic and civilizational decline, but I don't think it even occurred to Sanjeev to do any of that. Instead, he relies almost exclusively on GDP estimates to make his point. GDP estimates that everyone knows don't even give a full and accurate picture of the lives of ordinary people today, despite all the data and sophisticated statistical analysis we have now. I'm not saying these estimates are totally pointless, and I'm not even going to go into the data sets and methodology used to calculate these figures because that is way above my pay grade. But surely you need a little bit more than that to know about how people's lives changed over thousands of years, especially if you're going to make really audacious statements about golden ages and painful declines. The funniest thing is that when you look at Maddison's GDP estimates, it quickly becomes clear that the data actually raises serious questions about Sanjeev's theory. One of the data points he uses is contribution to global GDP. Between AD 1000 and 1820, he writes, India's share of world GDP fell from 29% to 16%. Okay, so far so good. But India's share of global GDP, according to Maddison, was even higher at the beginning of the Common Era. In the year 0, it was 33%. So by his own rationale, India was hardly an transcendent economic superpower in the supposed golden age between the years 0 and 1000 AD. It was still the world's largest economy, whatever the fuck that means, but it was already ceding ground to other regions of the world. Furthermore, Maddison's estimates actually show that during this supposed golden age, that is 0 to 1000 AD, the Indian economy did not grow at all in real terms. The total GDP is shown to be exactly the same in the years 0 and 1000 AD in his tables, something that Sanjeev for some reason fails to mention. So apparently, all the innovation and entrepreneurship of the golden age was unable to increase the GDP over the course of a millennium. But then, over the next 500 years, the so-called period of fossilization, the GDP almost doubled. And it's not just absolute GDP, but also GDP per capita that follows a similar trend. Stagnation between years 0 and 1000 AD, and then an increase between years 1000 and 1500 AD. If GDP estimates are all we are using to judge the health of an economy and the well-being of people, and I don't think that's the correct approach because things were a million times more complex than what such gross generalizations and abstractions can capture, but if that's what we're doing, then we can say that in purely aggregate economic terms, India was in a much better shape in 1500 AD than at any other time in the preceding 1500 years. Of course, there is no denying that around this time, Western Europe started growing more quickly, expanded its share of world GDP, and soon surpassed both India and China in terms of GDP per capita. The reasons for this relative decline or lagging behind are definitely worth looking into, but I don't think it makes any sense to suggest, as Sanjeev does, that the sole cause was, quote, a change in cultural attitudes. Not to say that cultural attitudes are unchanging, of course, they're constantly shifting, but underneath, at the level of the structure of society, both India and China were basically feudalistic societies that had existed for thousands of years with varying degrees of stability, economic development, centralization, and commercialization. And as far as feudalistic societies go, where the pursuit of economic growth is not an end in itself as it is in capitalist societies, India and China were doing okay. Their elites were doing more or less the same things that had been done in previous generations to reproduce the social relations of feudalism. In that sense, the anomaly was Europe, also a feudalistic society, but one in which strange and unprecedented things started happening around 500 years ago, all of which led to the dawn of the age of European imperialism and, of course, the development of global capitalism. If we are to understand the reasons behind India and China being overtaken by Europe, then I think the question we should be asking, which Sanjeev cannot even properly articulate, is why did these things happen in Europe and not in India or China, both of which were more economically developed than the former? Honestly, this is such an insanely complex question that I am obviously not qualified to answer it in any satisfactory way. But you know what? Neither is Sanjeev. He is quick to mention that in his view, the reasons for India's so-called cultural backwardness cannot be attributed entirely to the establishment of Islamic dynasties and kingdoms in India. Thanks for that, Sanjeev. But if it wasn't the Muslims that caused this cultural backwardness, what was it? And here things get very vague. So apparently, civilizational decline was caused by cultural backwardness, which in turn was caused by technological naivete, which was a sign of intellectual fossilization, which came about due to lack of cultural openness to new ideas, and that happened because all great civilizations eventually lose their vigor and go into decline, which to me is like a non-answer because we are back to where we started in the chain of causality. The ultimate cause of civilizational decline apparently is civilizational decline because as time passes, shit happens. Sanjeev's explanation for Europe's rise is equally unsatisfactory. In his mind, it was the Renaissance which inculcated values like openness, innovation, and risk-taking that led to the rise of the middle class, secularization, mass literacy, and ultimately to the growth of capitalism. Which is like, okay, I can see how those things could be related, but surely it was far from the only cause, let alone the main cause. Nowhere in this pathetic book does Sanjeev dwell seriously on how closely Europe's rise and the development of capitalism was linked to the systematic genocide, violence, and loot perpetrated by European powers across 3 continents for hundreds of years. How much of that precious European GDP came from the exploitation of forced indigenous labor and slave labor in the silver mines of colonial Spain in Central and South America? How much GDP was generated by selling African people into slavery so they could work the Portuguese sugar plantations in Brazil or the cotton plantations of the American South? How much GDP came from flooding China with opium as the British did in the 18th and 19th centuries, who then went to war when the Chinese tried to do something about all the drugs pouring into their country? How much GDP increase was from literally stealing bread from the mouths of tens of millions of Indian people who starved to death in British India because food grain exports to Europe raised prices beyond their purchasing capacity? None of these questions are raised by Sanjeev, perhaps because they show that the development of capitalism had much more to do with brute force and conquest than with any Renaissance or Enlightenment values of openness and tolerance. If you are like me and completely frustrated with Sanjeev's bullshit explanations for why and how capitalism developed in Europe and not elsewhere, I would strongly suggest reading economist Giovanni Arrighi's book, The Long 20th Century, which covers these questions in a much better way. One point that Arrighi makes, which I'll highlight very quickly, is that to retrospectively look back at the actions and strategies of Indian or Chinese elites and pronounce them as wrong or irrational because they did not lead to the development of capitalism, as Sanjeev suggests, makes little sense, as they were guided by what he calls the territorial logic of power, according to which control over territory and population was considered the primary goal of state activity. In contrast, late medieval Europe began to witness the rise of states such as the city-state of Venice, in which a capitalist logic of power dominated and where the accumulation of capital was the most important goal of state activity. If you want to know why that happened, you have to read the book, but just to finish the point, the fact that following the capitalist logic of power helped Europe to conquer the world does not make it any more rational than states that follow the territorial logic of power. They are different logics, different ways of thinking about the world, different structures, incentives, and drives. And if you actually think about the consequences of following the capitalist logic of power, which only seeks endless expansion, consequences like the horrors of European imperialism, the bloodshed of 2 world wars, and the long-term destruction of the natural world, the basis of our entire existence, how rational is this logic really? Okay, now for some good news and bad news. The bad news is that we've only still discussed the first chapter of the book, and that too partially. However, I do have good news. There is literally nothing else in this book that is even remotely new and original, and hence there is nothing else to talk about. It's all the same old socialism bad, free markets good, let's privatize everything, India great, India superpower, that kind of nonsense we're all familiar with, and I don't think there's any need to address all that again. I think we've all endured enough torture already. I actually feel like I have radiation poisoning from spending too much time in the nuclear wasteland that is Sanjeev Sanyal's brain. To sum up, this book is absolute garbage. It reeks of the smugness and arrogance of a person who thinks they're blowing everyone's minds with facts and logic, but who aren't even smart enough to properly hide their intellectual dishonesty. I mean, at least make it a little difficult to spot that you've shamelessly withheld information from your readers, information that, happens to contradict your stupid theory. This thing is badly written, barely researched, and worst of all, terribly dull. 0 on 10, would not recommend at all. If you see a copy of the book, just burn it. I promise you, it will instantly make the world a much better place.